And this is a chapter from the book Spiritual Warfare, Fighting the Good Fight by Father Vivian Boland, part of the Deeper Christianity series of booklets from the Catholic Truth Society. Now, as in the other Catholic Truth Society booklets that I've done readings from, these are not necessarily my views. I just think they're interesting and worth considering. Now, this chapter is entitled Not Just Flesh and Blood, and the section I'm going to read is called Cosmic Battle. And essentially this is referring to the cosmic battle for our souls between the forces of good and evil. And in the Catholic prism, through the Catholic prism, rather, that means between God and between Satan. In the first chapter, we propose a triangular model for the spiritual struggle. Temptation has three aspects: lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life. There is a triangle in which we must live: relation to self, others, God. The classical works of asceticism are three: fasting, almsgiving, prayer. And the vows of religion, seeking to confront directly the threefold root of sin in us, are also three: chastity, poverty, obedience. But our struggle, as St. Paul says in the letter to the Ephesians, is not just with flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. This is why the Christian, if he or she is to remain standing in the evil day, must put on the whole armour of God in order to stand against the wiles of the devil. There is any number of Testament texts that speak about these spiritual hosts and about the struggle with them in which we are also involved. We do not have to turn to the book of Revelations, for the Gospels themselves are full of this cosmic drama. In his ministry, Jesus is not only a teacher and a healer, he is also an exorcist, come to take on and to overpower the spirits of evil and sin, of sickness and death. The demons themselves recognize him as one more powerful than themselves. Reading through the narratives of the Passion in all four Gospels, it is clear that things are happening not just on the level of the relationship between Jesus, the Father, and ourselves, and not just on the political level of conflict and misunderstanding between Jesus, the Jewish leaders, and the Romans. But intertwined with those, spiritual warfare, in another sense, is underway, a conflict between the kingdom of this world and the kingdom of God, involving realities that are beyond human beings, but are of crucial importance to us. St. Luke concludes his account of the temptations of Jesus by telling us that the devil departed from him until an opportune time. That opportune time, the hour of which Jesus often speaks, is the time of his passion, death, and resurrection. The hour of Jesus is the hour of the Paschal mystery through which we are redeemed. At the beginning of the account of Jesus washing the disciples' feet, St. John tells us that the devil has already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray him. The time has come for the showdown. As it unfolds, it seems that darkness is triumphant, and the Prince of Darkness has conquered yet again. Jesus is condemned, is crucified, and dies on the cross. But God's power reaches even into the kingdom of death, the last enemy of humankind, and the swallowing up of Jesus by death becomes the hour of the triumph of God's glory. The Father's only Son, freely accepting his death and having dwelt among the dead, is raised by the Father's power into the glory of the resurrection. His victory means new and eternal life for us. The invisible creation. Whenever we say the Creed, we express our faith in God as the creator of heaven and earth and the maker of all things visible and invisible. How are we to understand this reference to the invisible creation? It means things invisible in themselves, not just invisible in the sense of not yet having come within our line of vision. Past or future events on this earth are invisible in that sense. We cannot witness them. But we know that the Creed means something more than this. It refers to immaterial creatures made by God but spiritual and not physical. In the great hymn to Christ in the letter to the Colossians, we read that all things were created in him, through him, and for him, in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or authorities. The hymn is worth quoting in full and repays constant meditation. God has delivered us from the dominion of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption through the forgiveness of sins. And that hymn is as follows. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions, or principalities or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to him all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Notice that another point is quickly made, not only that there is an invisible creation, but that, however we think of it, it does not fall outside the work of Christ. Christ is the firstborn of creation, and everything that is created, whether visible or invisible, is created in him, through him and for him. Likewise, Christ is the firstborn from the dead, the beginning of the new creation. In making peace by the blood of his cross, he has reconciled all things to himself, not only things on earth, but also things in heaven. So we are not tempted to be Manichees. Manichaeism is a recurring error that finds it easier to understand spiritual warfare, the battle between flesh and spirit, between good and evil, and a battle between two equal and opposing principles, the God who created the spiritual realm and another God who created the physical realm. St. Augustine was persuaded by this view for a time, until he came to see that evil too must fall within the plan and power of God. It is a more difficult teaching to understand that the devil and his angels are creatures of God and not powers opposed to him on the same level as God. The powers of darkness, just as they do not fall outside God's creating power, do not fall outside the work of God's redemption in Christ, at least in the sense they do not succeed in foiling that redemption. We are told that all things are made subject to Christ, all principalities and powers, even death itself, so that he can present an eternal kingdom to the Father when God will be all in all. Evil does not have the last word, and nor does sin or death. Sin is behovely. Julian of Norwich tells us that Jesus revealed to her this strange fact, that sin is behovely. It means sin is fitting and appropriate, even in some sense necessary. It does not mean that sin is nothing. Think of the suffering it causes, Julian says. But sin is behovely because God can make it serve his purposes. Paradoxically, those things that soil the glory of God are made to testify to the glory and mean it is more gloriously revealed. The liturgy of the Easter Vigil puts it this way: O happy fault, O necessary sin of Adam, which gained for us so great a Redeemer. O certainly necessary sin of Adam, which cancelled by the death of Christ. O happy fault, which gained such and so great a Redeemer. A contemporary theologian who has written much about this mystery and the victory of Christ over sin is Hans Ur von Balthasar, basing himself not only on the texts of the New Testament, such as the Hymn of the Colossians, but also on the experiences of the Christian mystics, including his friend Adrian von Speer. Balthasar believes Christians are obliged to hope for the salvation of all. We cannot claim to know either all are saved or that some are lost, for the judgment belongs to God, but the commandment to love all obliges us to hope for the salvation of all. The moment in the Paschal mystery that illustrates the truth of this doctrine is the descent of Christ into hell. What does it mean to say that he descended into hell? It means that the victory of Jesus reached all corners of creation, even the darkest ones. There is no created place, time, or experience that has not been touched by his redeeming power. Angels and demons. Our minds naturally ask the question, what kind of being are we talking about when we speak of spiritual creatures, either good or bad? Some might be tempted to avoid the issue by saying this way of thinking belongs to cosmology we have outgrown, an underworld, a world, and an overworld. And that the powers and principalities Jesus tackled are better explained in psychological, sociological, or other terms. After all, people often talk about struggling with their inner demons, and we know they are talking about psychological and moral battles. People talk about the power of invisible things like the market, or institutionalized prejudice, or the atmosphere in a group. Realities that are in themselves invisible, but whose effects and consequences are all too visible. There are impersonal things that are powerful in our world, though the Church has difficulty in accepting that there can be social sins in a strict sense, whose evil is not attributable to individual human moral agents. But Christianity has always believed also in the reality of spiritual beings active within creation for good and for ill. in ways that are relevant to us and to our relationship with God. A moment's reflection on our personal experiences of struggle in trying to live the Christian life will confirm that we are up against forces stronger than ourselves. Scrupoli is in no doubt that the devil is active in trying to prevent and confuse our efforts to follow Christ more faithfully. John Paul II speaks of diabolical deceit that causes some evils to present themselves under the appearance of good. The devil uses things, people, and events against us, but only because God allows him to test us. Nevertheless, St. Paul expresses concern that the tempter might try us too hard, and Jesus teaches us to pray that we are not led into temptation. The Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner writes about the theology of sleep and speaks about the supernatural battles that take place over the beds of sleeping Christians. Things happen in the course of the night. The Bible speaks of God revealing things in dreams. God's people are then more vulnerable to spiritual interference, a fact that is recognized in the liturgy of Compline, the prayer that seeks God's protection from the dangers of the night. But even when awake, we may be conscious of the interference and distraction of spiritual powers that are in us but not of us. In his letter to the Romans, St. Paul makes a startling statement. I do not understand my own actions. I do not do what I want, he continues, but do the very thing I hate. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but the sin which dwells within me. This is very reassuring, at least, in helping us understand the reality of our struggle. In the story of Adam and Eve, it is likewise reassuring that we see the presence and hear the voice of the tempter. In the same moment in which we are presented with human responsibility for evil, we seem to be relieved of full responsibility for it. There are other forces at work around us and within us. This is how wise teachers have always understood the spiritual struggle. The Bible itself tells us two things about sin. On the one hand, it is free and conscious human action for which individual moral agents are responsible. On the other hand, it is a power reaching beyond human capacities and leading us into actions which we do not fully understand. From hidden faults equip me, Psalm 19 says. How can they be false if they are hidden, and how can they be hidden if they are false? Sin is a power working through us for which we cannot be asked to bear full responsibility. Although we strengthen the power of sin by our choices and actions, sin itself is more powerful than us, something in which we are unavoidably caught up. This has always been part of the Church's doctrine of original sin. We find ourselves in a situation not of our own making, which nevertheless means we are alienated from God. Scupoli anticipates modern psychology in speaking of things human beings do unconsciously, or as a result of what we might call, although he does not use this phrase, a death instinct. There is something self-destructive and self-subversive in human beings that leads us to act against our own best interests. Much of the spiritual struggle is with this death instinct, and as such it is a fight for our survival as spiritual beings and as believers. St. Paul says it is sin dwelling within us. St. Paul puts it more dramatically. Be sober, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith. Just as there are evil spirits who influence we need to resist, there are good spirits whose power helps us. There are good invisible powers and forces, like the spirit of a community that is charitable and truthful, or the atmosphere of prayer that attaches to places where holy lives have been led. Such realities also work on us and through us, even though they are not things for which we can claim credit. Such good spirits are strengthened by our choices and actions, although they too are more powerful than us. The Church teaches us about great archangels, Gabriel, Raphael, Michael, messengers of God sent to enlighten, guide, and protect human beings. If we really believe in God's interests in all the details of our lives, every hair on your head has been counted, then the Church's teaching about guardian angels makes perfect sense. The heavenly world is as near to us as we are to ourselves, and God cares, supports us at all times. Turn but a stone and start a wing, is how the Catholic poet Francis Thompson expressed his faith in the closeness of the spiritual world to the physical world. In another poem he says that Jacob's ladder, with its angelic traffic ascending and descending, is set up in every ordinary place, pitched, as he put it, betwixt heaven and Charing Cross. For his part, Thomas Merton writes that the monk has his face turned towards the desert. His ears are attuned not to the echoes of the apostate that storms the city of Babylon, but to the silence of the far mountains, on which the armies of God and the enemy confront one another in a mysterious battle, of which the battle in the world is only a pale reflection. Revelation 12 speaks about a great sign of a woman who is giving birth to the one who is to rule the nations. With a great battle in progress around her, and the devil out to get her, she, Mary and the church, is led to a refuge in the wilderness where she will be nourished. Merton says the monastic church hides her face in the mystery of the divine silence and prays while the great battle is being fought between heaven and earth. Her flight is not an evasion, he says, for if the monk were able to understand what goes on inside him, he would be able to say how well he knows that the battle is being fought in his own heart. What is true of the monk is true of any Christian who seeks to follow Christ. It is not an evasion of responsibility to say we must contend with powers that are more than flesh and blood. It is, once again, simply to recognize the reality of our situation. The moral and spiritual struggle of the individual Christian is his way of participating in the great battle. The Church exercises a ministry of exorcism, not only in the simple exorcism performed on every person who seeks to become a Christian, but in the solemn exorcisms where demonic influence is judged to be at work. Apart from the human and other created spirits, through whether the latter are good or evil, there is first and foremost the Holy Spirit, who bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. On what better ground can we stand in facing the threat of created spiritual powers than that established in us by the uncreated Spirit, God Himself, poured into our hearts to make us partakers in divine nature? And that chapter, again, is called Not Just Flesh and Blood. And I hope you found that interesting. I know I did. It's interesting to think of the perspective that sin isn't the case of the individual. And this particular chapter makes the case that there is outside spiritual influences, both good and evil, who are fighting for ourselves, essentially. And that the cosmic battleground is within every one of us. And I think it's also worth contemplating here that the power of prayer here is mentioned a few times, or referred to indirectly as a big influence in that battle. And I guess that is really in any Abrahamic faith. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, and there will be more videos coming soon on different esoteric topics, theology, and spiritual matters, and of course photography.